The first label of the drink featured a barefoot character holding a rifle, shooting at a man running away with a burning still. Beside them was a pig, an outhouse, and the words "Bottled by Barney and Ollie."
No neon, no lightning, no hint of the energy and extreme sports that are associated with this brand today by virtually every teenager on the planet. And the drink wasn't even created as a standalone soft drink in the first place. It was invented to mask the taste of cheap whiskey. Today, it is one of the most recognizable drinks on the planet, the official fuel of esports and extreme sports, synonymous with the word energy for an entire generation and commanding roughly 80% of the U.S. citrus soda category. But for the first 20 years of its existence, it was an almost invisible regional product of the American South, taken seriously by virtually no one except a handful of bartenders in Tennessee. I'll tell you how a drink created to make moonshine easier to swallow became a beverage literally associated with widespread dental decay in one region of the country, and how the same brand managed to transform from a rural caricature of Appalachian poverty into a symbol of urban youth culture, and eventually a staple on the gamer's desk. And I'll also tell you about the lawsuit where the manufacturer's lawyers seriously argued in court that their own drink was capable of dissolving a mouse. Brothers Barney and Ollie Hartman moved to Knoxville, Tennessee in 1932 after the bottling plant for Orange Crush, where they had worked in Georgia, went bankrupt. In their new home, they ran into a simple problem. Their favorite whiskey mixer, a lemon-lime drink called Natural Setup, simply wasn't sold in Tennessee. Rather than drive 300 miles back to Georgia just to get the syrup they needed, the brothers decided to make something similar themselves, a heavily carbonated, tart lemon-lime drink that did an excellent job of masking the harshness of cheap bourbon. Getting the recipe to taste exactly right for their evening whiskey became almost a family joke. And for the name, they borrowed a piece of Appalachian folklore. Mountain Dew was an old slang term for moonshine, known from 19th century folk songs, including a famous composition by Uncle Dave Macon that was later popularized again by Grandpa Jones in the 1940s. At first, the drink wasn't sold at all. The brothers made it exclusively for themselves and their friends. It wasn't until 1946, when they brought a prototype to a regional beverage convention in Gatlinburg, that people they knew suggested there might actually be money to be made from it. They didn't file for a patent until 1948, by which point a competing company in a neighboring city had already overtaken them and released its own version of Mountain Dew before the drink's original creators could get theirs onto the market. Remarkably, even before the official launch, the brothers had approached Coca-Cola, the biggest beverage company in their home region, just across the border in Georgia, with a partnership proposal. Coca-Cola turned them down. Had Atlanta said yes at that moment, the history of Mountain Dew might have turned out very differently. The label, designed in 1948 by artist John Bricketto, became the brand's signature for the next 20 years. And today, it looks frankly uncomfortable. The artwork wasn't commissioned from a professional advertising agency. It was drawn by hand, essentially as a test label for the bottles the brothers carried with them to regional soft drink conventions. It featured a character nicknamed Willy the Hillbilly, barefoot, dressed in ragged clothes, carrying a rifle and chasing a tax agent who was desperately running away from an illegal moonshine still. Beside them were a hound dog, a pig, and an outhouse. At the bottom was the phrase, "Filled by Barney and Ollie," a joke referencing the way a moonshiner might hand-fill a jug of homemade liquor. This entire visual identity played on the stereotype of poor white Appalachian mountain residents, uneducated, armed, and living outside the law, and presented it to the public as amusing, charming rural exoticism. By today's standards, advertising like this would probably trigger an immediate controversy. But in the late 1940s, it was generally seen more as harmless Southern self-parody than as an insult, partly because the brand's creators themselves came from the same region they were parodying. A similar aesthetic was experiencing something of a cultural revival at the time. Not long before this, the banjo player Grandpa Jones had gained national popularity with his performance of Good Old Mountain Dew, deliberately drawing on the stage persona of an earlier performer, Uncle Dave Mackin.
The image of the loud, unruly, convention-defying mountain dweller was perceived by audiences of the era almost the way the rebellious hippie image would be perceived decades later: eccentric, unconventional, but not necessarily offensive.
The original drink created by the Hartman brothers had almost nothing in common with what is sold under the name today. It was clear, caffeine-free, and lemon-lime flavored, much closer to 7-Up or Sprite. Sales were sluggish, the product sat on store shelves, and the brothers never managed to turn it into a truly mass-market business. In 1957, the rights to the brand were acquired by a Virginia company called Tip Corporation. Chemist Bill Bridgeforth set out to reformulate the drink, first tackling a very practical problem: excessive carbonation, which caused bottles to explode during transportation.
That was more than a minor inconvenience. It was a serious obstacle to selling the drink through an ordinary retail network, rather than simply handing it out from friends behind a bar. In 1961, another employee, Bill Jones, took over the project. He added orange juice concentrate, intensified the citrus profile, and turned the drink into a much sweeter, richer version that was far closer to the flavor we recognize today. By then, the original, almost colorless lemon-lime version had virtually disappeared. The new formula tasted much more like an orange soda with a hint of lime than the classic whiskey mixer the drink had originally been created to be. By the early 1960s, Tip Corporation was selling more than 10 million cases a year, and that success quickly caught the attention of much bigger players in the beverage industry.
In August 1964, Pepsi-Cola's board of directors approved a deal to acquire the rights to Mountain Dew from Tip Corporation. From that moment on, the drink gained access to a national distribution network, precisely the infrastructure that the independent owners in Tennessee and Virginia had lacked to expand beyond the southern states. By then, several major national corporations were already showing interest in the brand. But Pepsi was the first to turn those discussions into a concrete offer and had secured Jones' agreement as early as March of that year.
2 years later, Pepsi launched Mountain Dew's first nationwide advertising campaign under the slogan, "Yahoo! Mountain Dew, it'll tickle your innards," deliberately using an exaggerated Southern dialect right in the slogan itself. The rural imagery didn't disappear immediately either. Willie the Hillbilly remained part of the packaging for several more years. It wasn't until 1969 when the company realized that the overt hillbilly image didn't fit particularly well with Mountain Dew's growing urban and youth-oriented market that it redesigned the logo and shifted toward a more neutral image centered on outdoor recreation. That change marked the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead to a completely different marketing strategy 2 decades later. Interestingly, even after abandoning the hillbilly image, the company continued cycling through slogans every few years. Get that barefoot feeling, put a little Yahoo in your life, and briefly, Hello Sunshine, an attempt to tap into the hippie aesthetic of the late 1960s, before finally finding a much more enduring formula in the 1980s.
By the mid-1980s, the image of Mountain Dew as a drink for outdoor recreation was beginning to feel stale. PepsiCo saw a new trend emerging among a younger generation. Skateboarding, snowboarding, BMX, and more broadly, an extreme sports culture that major beverage brands had barely tapped into at the time. That's when the slogan, "Do the Do," was born, along with an entirely new identity for the brand: aggressive, rebellious, and built around risk and adrenaline rather than rural humor. Mountain Dew commercials in the 1990s showed the drink almost exclusively in motion. People launching off ramps, racing mountain bikes, surfing on the edge of a wipeout. An unofficial rule even emerged that the brand followed for decades. Mountain Dew was almost never shown poured into an ordinary glass. It appeared in a can or bottle, in motion, while someone was running, jumping, or flying, as if the very idea of sitting down for a quiet drink went against the spirit of the brand. The campaign worked so well that Mountain Dew practically monopolized the association between extreme sports and soft drinks for the next 15 years, long before Red Bull and its stratospheric jump even appeared on the radar of the average American teenager. In many ways, Mountain Dew was the first beverage brand to prove that you could sell an entire lifestyle rather than a taste or simply a way to quench your thirst, a lesson that other energy drink brands would later use to spectacular effect. The brand also has one genuinely darkly comic legal story. In the 2000s, a consumer filed a lawsuit against PepsiCo claiming that he had found the remains of a mouse inside an opened can of Mountain Dew. PepsiCo's defense in court sounded almost absurd. The company's lawyers argued that the drink's high acidity was aggressive enough to completely dissolve a rodent's body during the time the can remained sealed, leaving no recognizable remains behind. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed on that basis. To an outside observer, it sounds like a questionable compliment to the product. The defense essentially relied on the argument that the contents of the can were acidic enough to destroy bone tissue. PepsiCo's lawyers had to choose between a reputational problem and losing the case, and apparently decided that the former was the lesser of two evils. And this part of the story is far more serious than the mouse joke. Across the Appalachian region, stretching from southern New York State all the way down to Alabama, a deeply rooted culture of constant soft drink consumption has developed, and Mountain Dew has historically remained the #1 drink there. It was literally born in this region and spent decades as a local cultural symbol. Researchers in the area have noted that residents sometimes carry a bottle of the drink with them throughout the entire day, taking small sips from morning until evening rather than finishing it in one sitting, as is more typical with most other soft drinks. A 12-ounce serving contains roughly 11 teaspoons of sugar, noticeably more than a comparable serving of Coca-Cola or Pepsi, while its high acidity can further contribute to the erosion of tooth enamel. According to estimates from researchers at the Appalachian College of Law, as many as 26% of preschool children in the region suffer from tooth decay, while around 15% of young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 have already had at least one tooth extracted because of enamel damage, figures significantly higher than the national averages for the same age group. The phenomenon became known colloquially as Mountain Dew mouth, a widely recognized medical and cultural term used by dentists and journalists to describe the regional problem. A dentist from Barberville, Kentucky, spent years traveling throughout the region in a converted truck equipped as a mobile dental clinic specifically to address the problem locally, investing $150,000 of his own money to convert the vehicle. Of course, reducing the problem to a single soft drink would be an unfair oversimplification. Poverty, limited access to dental care, and distrust of tap water in some rural areas all play a role. As a result, some residents prefer soda to tap water. Nearly half of Kentucky residents, for example, have relied exclusively on well water for years, sometimes of questionable quality. But after the story received national attention in 2009, PepsiCo publicly said it had contacted doctors working in the region to better understand the scale of the problem, a rare case of a major beverage company openly engaging with such an uncomfortable issue involving its own product.
There is an almost bitter irony to this part of the story. In Appalachia, where the brand was born, and where it was once sold as a symbol of local identity and pride in its roots, activists and doctors now call for restrictions on purchasing it with government food assistance benefits. A drink created by local people for local consumers has, 80 years later, become the subject of a public debate about the health of those very same communities. The debate over whether soda purchases should be restricted under food assistance programs, incidentally, continues to resurface in Congress and in the news, even though those programs were designed to support basic nutrition, not to subsidize a product that can, over time, leave the same recipients facing bills for tooth extractions. Not all of the brand's history is dark. There's also a much lighter story about how a single flavor can become a cult favorite. In 2004, Taco Bell and PepsiCo decided to create an exclusive beverage specifically for the restaurant chain, primarily to encourage more purchases through the drive-thru, which, according to the company's own estimates, generated as much as 2/3 of restaurant revenue. After testing several variations, they chose Mountain Dew as the base. It turned out that Taco Bell customers were 1.5 times more likely to order Mountain Dew than the average soft drink customer. That's how Baja Blast was born, a tropical lime-flavored Mountain Dew originally available exclusively at Taco Bell restaurants. The exclusivity worked surprisingly well. For years, fans would literally show up at Taco Bell with empty jugs to stock up on the drink, while others tried to recreate the flavor at home using their own recipes. For its 10th anniversary in 2014, the company finally agreed to release a limited retail batch. The company analyzed more than 30,000 tweets mentioning the drink and personally responded to 500 of its most devoted fans, incorporating details from their original requests so that each person received something that felt personal rather than mass-produced. The campaign trended nationally on Twitter twice without any paid promotion and generated nearly 83% engagement, a figure most advertising agencies could only dream of. Only in 2024, 20 years after its launch, did Baja Blast finally become a permanent product on store shelves rather than a seasonal limited release tied to a single fast food chain. The companies deliberately chose the 20th anniversary for the move, calling the celebration Baja-versary and giving away free servings of the drink at Taco Bell locations across the country. It was a rare example of artificially created scarcity, maintained for 20 decades, ultimately working better than almost any traditional advertising campaign. At the beginning of the 21st century, the brand once again began searching for a new audience. In 2001, when sales growth had stalled at a modest 2% per year, PepsiCo introduced Mountain Dew Code Red, a cherry-flavored version of the drink aimed not at the predominantly white, rural, and suburban youth associated with extreme sports, but at a much more ethnically diverse urban audience. At the same time, without any dedicated advertising campaign, the brand organically found another niche: gaming culture. Mountain Dew's high caffeine and sugar content had made it an informal fuel for late-night gaming sessions as early as the 1990s, and by the 2010s, the internet had firmly cemented the association between Mountain Dew and Doritos as a visual shorthand for the stereotypical gamer, endlessly recycled through memes and jokes about life in front of a computer. PepsiCo quickly picked up on that organic association and made it official, launching the Game Fuel line with a formula specifically adjusted for long gaming sessions. It was a rare case of a brand not creating a subculture around itself, but instead recognizing one that already existed and formalizing its connection to it, rather than imposing an image from above, as it had done with the rural aesthetic in the 1940s or extreme sports in the 1990s. Modern Mountain Dew, by the way,
still contains noticeably more caffeine than most mainstream soft drinks, about 54 milligrams per 355 milliliter can, even though the Hartman brothers' original version contained no caffeine at all. The irony is that a brand originally invented as a non-alcoholic mixer designed to soften the harshness of whiskey eventually became 80 years later one of the most stimulating drinks on the shelf. Instead of calming the effects of someone else's alcohol, Mountain Dew now creates the stimulation itself.
Let's go back to where it all began. A basement, a whiskey mixer, and a joke between two bartenders that accidentally turned into a business. A drunk invented to mask the taste of cheap bourbon spent the next 80 years becoming an Appalachian caricature of rural poverty, a symbol of the great outdoors, the face of extreme sports, a contributor to a genuine dental crisis in its home region, and finally, the unofficial fuel of an entire generation of gamers. Throughout all of those transformations, the brand never fundamentally changed its formula. What changed was the story told around that formula.
Perhaps that is exactly why Mountain Dew survived so many radical changes in identity without suffering a truly catastrophic collapse. The drink never had a single, deeply rooted cultural identity worth protecting. Coca-Cola is associated with tradition and family gatherings. Sprite is associated with coolness and freshness. Mountain Dew, from the very beginning, was something different. A drink without a fixed identity, simply sharp, sweet, and intensely stimulating, designed to help you get through something difficult, whether that meant a glass of bad whiskey, a mountain bike descent, or a sleepless night in front of a computer screen.
Perhaps the only thing that remained unchanged through all of these transformations was the formula itself. The orange citrus base created by Bill Jones in 1961 became the foundation for virtually every modern variation of the brand, from Code Red to Baja Blast. The additions and flavor nuances may change, but the core taste profile has remained recognizable for more than 60 years, far longer than any of the identities advertising ever built around it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. There's more to come. And here's the question for the comments. What surprised you more? The original Hillbilly label with the rifle? Or the fact that the same drink is both fuel for extreme sports and a contributing factor in a real dental crisis in Appalachia? Personally, the hardest section for me to write was the one about the teeth. It's rare to tell the history of a brand alongside real statistics about children's health rather than simply sales figures and advertising slogans.